Hi, this is Gabe Cook, Director of Debate Kansas City, and today I'm going to take you through a guide on how to judge Student Congress. If you're watching this video, most likely it's because you've decided to dedicate some time to Debate Kansas City to make debate happen, and we thank you for that. The process for this video will include me going through a guide that you should see linked above this video that you're watching if you're watching it on the DKC blog. So feel free to download that and look at the guide as I'm going through it to help follow along. Without further ado, why don't we just jump right in to an introduction of your most basic duty as a Student Congress judge. You are playing the role of a scorer, and most of your time will be spent scoring speeches on a scale of 1 to 6. 1 being an absolutely terrible speech, 6 being an absolutely amazing speech. The speeches will be 3 minutes long, and after each speech, students will be asked questions from the entire floor of the Congress. You will not evaluate the questions in the evaluation of your speech on that 1 to 6 scale. Instead, questions will go into another process called nominations. Now, I'm not going to describe nominations quite yet. We have a couple other things we need to explain, but just know in the back of your head that nominations are going to be important. So now that you have a very quick understanding of your most basic job, let's talk about the setup of Student Congress itself. Student Congress is an event where students mimic the same kind of floor debate that you might see in the United States Congress. And it is governed by what we call Robert's Rules of Order. These are pretty basic democratic parliamentary rules that allow for equitable speaking time and provide a number of different procedures to help guide a session. In a given session of Student Congress, you're going to have 20 to 30 students in a room, and they will have been given mock legislation in advance of the tournament. And they will have had time to prepare research and speeches over that mock legislation. Students will open up debate over one piece of legislation, and then they'll have rotating pro and con speeches over that piece of legislation until the student body decides that they're ready to vote on that legislation and move on and debate over another topic. In the room of Student Congress, there'll be a person who is the presiding officer. This is the person that holds the rules and that puts the rules into enforce. They're the person that calls on the speakers, they call on the question askers, and they also make rulings on any other issues of parliamentary procedure. Now, the presiding officer can actually be a student, and when a student performs the role of presiding officer, you will evaluate them with your own presiding officer ballot. Presiding officers are scored on a scale of 1 to 6. Only they're not giving individual speeches, so instead you're evaluating their entire performance as the presiding officer. And oftentimes Student Congress events are divided into sessions. So at a Debate Kansas City weeknight tournament, there are typically 2 sessions. So if you had a student serving as the presiding officer, you would give them a score of 1 to 6 for the first session, you would give them a score of 1 to 6 for the second session. Now, in the event that a student is not performing the role of presiding officer, a coach will perform that role. In the event the student is the presiding officer, the coach moves into a secondary role known as the parliamentarian. And they're there basically to make sure that the student is being fair and doing a good job as presiding officer. And an easy way to know whether or not a student presiding officer is doing a good job is to see how much they have to communicate with the parliamentarian. If they're able to run the session and they seem in control of things and the adult sitting next to them has to do very little, that means that that person did a really good job and you should probably consider giving them a 5 or a 6 in the evaluation. So that's quite a bit of information, but hopefully it gives you a basic idea of the setup. 20 to 30 students in the room, governed by Robert's Rules of Order, a presiding officer calling on who's going to give what speech when, who's going to be able to ask what questions when. That presiding officer could be a student, and if it is a student, you need to score them. Or that could be an adult who is simply running the session, and your only job then is to evaluate speeches. Now, I told you earlier something to keep in mind was nominations, only I haven't described what nominations are yet. Well, at the very end of the session, when all the speeches have been given, you as the judge are given 5 nominations. And you'll see here on our form that with the nominations, you will be placing students in order 1 to 5. And you are literally putting them in order, 1 being the best, 2 the second best, 3 the third best, and so on. And what these nominations do is they virtually guarantee the student that you give a nomination to, 1 through 5, it virtually guarantees that they will place at the tournament. Now, the other adult in the room who could be performing the presiding officer role or could be performing the parliamentarian role, they will also nominate 5 students. They'll have the exact same nomination form as you. And when we score the session at the end, the nominations that come from the scorer and the nominations that come from the parliamentarian or presiding officer coach figure, those two are combined to create a top 5 for the entire Student Congress session. The scores that you give as the scorer are used to break any ties, and they should also be used to help inform you as the judge on who you thought the best 5 students in the room were. Now, the presiding officer, if it's performed by a student, can be given a nomination. And in fact, when presiding officers do a really good job, they are often and should be nominated, because being a presiding officer is actually a very difficult role. So, you're scoring speeches 1 to 6. You're mindful whether or not the student is a presiding officer and if you have to score them 1 to 6. And at the end, you pick 5 students to give a nomination to. But what we haven't done is talk about how exactly you score the Student Congress speakers on that 1 to 6 scale. Well, there's a few tips that I can give you kind of on how to operate and use that scale. We'll start with a 1, the worst speech somebody could give. A 1 should be reserved for somebody that says something offensive. Maybe it's sexist or racist or classist or something to where that student needs a little bit of punishment for saying something utterly offensive. A 1 could also be given to a student who shows absolutely no effort or is trying to make a mockery of the event itself. A 2 will come for a student who is giving a well below average speech. They probably didn't make many salient points. They probably didn't talk for much more than a minute. A 3 will go to a student that's giving a slightly below average speech. Maybe they didn't make a lot of sense, but they had some element of the speech that was pretty decent, and there was maybe some kind of organization to it. Hopefully they spoke for at least over a minute. A 4 is a slightly above average speech. This student may have come close to using their full time. They may have made a couple pretty good points, but the speech might have been missing something. And one of the things that speech could have been missing would be a piece of outside research that they should quote in their speech, because that's what's key for the next 2 criteria. To give a student a 5 or a 6, that student should have at least 1 outside research citation in their speech. Part of the goal of the event of Student Congress is for students to become educated over the issues that they are debating. And one way to display that knowledge and gained expertise is by quoting outside sources. So a 5 or a 6, those speeches need to have some kind of outside research. And when you get into the 5 and the 6 scale, now you're talking about speeches that have organization, that have factually based opinions, that might have stories or anecdotes that really enhance the speech. Students should be using as much of the time as possible. They should also have eye contact. And this is something that we've been working on at Debate Kansas City, is to make sure that our students, when they're giving speeches, are enhancing them with eye contact rather than reading their speeches as though they're delivering a book report. And something else that you should really look for in value as you evaluate the speeches is a notion of clash. What we are trying to get our students to do is to listen to other arguments, identify those arguments, and then point out why those arguments are incorrect. So if you see students that are able to clash with opposing viewpoints and do so in a way that is succinct, you should really value that. One other thing to keep in mind is that, as I believe I mentioned earlier, after every speech, students are asked questions from the entire floor. These questions are not added into speech scores, but they should be considered for nominations. For example, let's say a student gave a speech that you marked as a 5, and they gave another speech that you marked as a 4. But one thing you noticed was that those students did an incredible job answering questions, and they did an amazing job being active in the session asking questions. That's something that should go into your calculus for nominations. Because with nominations, we're not just looking at how well the student gave a speech, we're also looking at how well they performed in the session. Were they a good democratic citizen, being able to ask and answer questions, but also treating their fellow Congresspeople with respect and generally helping to move the session along? If a student is doing those things, they should be rewarded, and it should help them get a nomination. One last note is a quick look at the speaker ballot. You'll notice that there are sections to evaluate multiple speeches. What you should do under each section of the ballot is give the speech a score and give a couple quick comments as you can with each speech. Keep in mind that one student could give multiple speeches and you will use the same ballot for the same speaker. It is also possible that there are children in the room that never stand up and give a speech. Those students never get a ballot because they never gave a speech to be scored. So, hopefully, in this relatively short amount of time, we were able to go over all the information that you need in order to be able to judge a session of Student Congress. We greatly thank you for your time and look forward to seeing you at Debate Kansas City tournaments.